So I'm Caitlyn Doran, and this is going to be my solo show, Diurnal-Nocturnal, and it's an exploration of sort of sunlit sensations and feelings versus kind of more seedy, steamy, nighttime, versions of what an alive creature feels and sees. I would say. In terms of, I think, the most propelling forces in my process, I'm really, really fascinated, always have been, with duality, juxtaposition, contrast. I think in particular, when I'm trying to form a new composition, I'm always looking to create interesting tension between things with dichotomy, right? Whether it's somebody that's very familiar to me next to or in a situation that's less familiar, right? I don't know Emma Stone personally. I'm sure she's lovely. But I like to borrow, I like to kind of extrapolate and then reimagine. However, the objects in this scene, the flower, and to even more closer extent, in this example, the figurine, right? That's my personal object. I'm very familiar with it. I've known it for years. I can touch it. I can do anything I want with it. But then this other image is, sourced. It's a paparazzi shot. I can't say who took it. I don't know a lot of the situation. So there's kind of a mystery to that image that there is none of to the use of this other little plastic toy. And I like bringing in like the known and the unknown in the same space and seeing how they resolve. Perhaps a conflict, do they form a friendship? Whatever it is, it ends up being intriguing, So yeah, I think that in this piece in particular was one of the first, might be actually the first piece that was finished for the show. And it's kind of what started my, I've always loved kind of being outside, but I think real outdoor scenery, plant matter, flora and fauna that was perhaps a little bit more wild than like a domestic pets. I've done those before, but this was sort of a spark moment, and I knew I just wanted to keep going with that. And I started to just stay more and more open to animals and plants around me as not just like in my life, things that are something I could take note of, but something I could start to bring in based on the kind of, energy that they seem to have, and then use that energy and just lend itself well to my work, basically. I think the way the sun was hitting the caged flowers and the way the sun seemed to hit her, like through this glass of, I believe she's in a cafe or something, like they kind of felt like the same, the same feeling, I suppose. Like she's just this wilted flower, that's also going to decay someday, maybe not as quickly as these plants, but it's that inevitable thing, and like forming connections between the two is really interesting to me. I would say, in terms of how ambitious of a display that I'm trying to put together for people, it has been growing. I think ever since my undergrad. I think as a reference point, right, I graduated from Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design, right, just 10 years ago. And that thesis exhibition, I think I painted one wall a certain kind of accent color that I think would go well with the work, and everything else was pretty standard, like 60 inches on center. But since that point, the way I showcase work has steadily started to break the mold, right? I think a couple of years ago I had a notable exhibition where I had like small 2-inch by 1-inch pieces that I was like putting at the very top of the wall, and like very much starting to treat these walls that I've been generously given like as canvases themselves almost, right? There's the works of art and that process of me getting that, but also thinking about the display and the way compositionally myself and then the viewer can take in the space was really interesting. And then now, it's not in this show, but I have been starting to play with works that go off the wall, and then in addition to that, works that incorporate paintings on the wall that kind of live in response to, the physical, tangible works that can kind of move around. Something ephemeral that is only going to accompany the piece while it's here. Something that increases the sort of immersive aspect for the viewer. Because I think a lot about attention, it's one of those keywords in my artist statement. I think about the feeling of focusing on one thing at a time. and then the feeling of split attention, or what monotasking looks and feels like. And I like to play with both of those things at the same time. I think they can lead to some healthy introspection about where we put our attention when it's being split, when it's being split too much, what is the cost of that. So there's more to look at. There's more, I think, to just, be absorbed. But I think it's almost like world building. That's what it's felt like to create this. So if I could step inside one of my paintings, or if the paintings became interconnected universes, right? This is maybe what it would start to look and feel like. Speaking to the contrast and conversations through, dueling forces that I like to work with. There's also this subtle difference in personality, and arguably maybe they're two sides of the same coin, like a seriousness and a humor. I think about pretty frequently that, human beings only live around, on average, 4,000 weeks. And with that very precious time, I think it's okay to acknowledge how temporary things are going to be. And because they're so temporary, it's not to take them lightly, but we don't have to take everything super seriously. And I like putting humor into the pieces. I like, if there is something that feels, like there's a stone-faced character and then there's something quite wacky right next to them, again, it's sort of, for me, often like that sensation, that sort of emotional climate that the serious next to the funny creates, is a reminder, that there's both of these things in life. They can be both of these things in work. These small characters that are showing up a lot in this show, there's a lot of repeats, I would say. There's repeats of imagery, there's repeats of characters, and in different ways, right? Sometimes it's like very, high res, like it's an honored sacred object, and other times it's like bright colors, cartoon, sleek contrast, anime finish, or pixelated, kind of crispness, with not the highest resolution suddenly. So again, that adds a quirkiness to it that I think lightens the space and lightens sometimes maybe darker feelings that are being accessed in a couple of them, particularly the nocturnal side of the show, right, is a little bit more closed off, maybe a little bit more of the acknowledgement of maybe things feelings that you don't always bring to the forefront, maybe. Whereas the sun is like the diurnal side of the show is very, very open and bright, and maybe a touch more whimsical. But yes, there's a couple pieces, like the two pixelated pieces, Tachibana and Humvee, which are the names of the characters, but they're just these little dolls that I have been kind of using as muses. I've had them for a while. But yes, I displayed their faces and made them really pixelated, and then printed them out, and then a couple of their friends are around here too. Two things that I kind of like to make converse are maybe a use of contemporary art and contemporary art aesthetics and sensibilities with the historical. And sometimes I'm doing this because I'm trying to contextualize, again, going back to maybe how temporary I think, this grand thing called life is. I think about what will have been my role in all this, if anything. And so I often look to artists of the past. There's two pieces and they're in close proximity, so they can, again, more obviously relate to each other in this way. But Genshiken Garden kind of splices my own version of a portion of Velasquez's piece called The Kitchen Maid. So it's in part, again, my own found imagery, whether with something that's, very much not within my grasp, not of my own making. It's my own hand trying to get in the shoes of another artist and interpret it. And through that, there's this extreme act of coming to know it, and I really, really like that. These are already pieces that I think about, and then when you have to recreate it, this act of verisimilitude, right? It kind of becomes part of your bones. And I really enjoy that process. And then I also like the result, wherein it's now Velasquez is having a conversation with something that's more originally my own. So yes, that kind of, they meet me thing happening on the picture plane is really interesting. As well as the other piece where I'm kind of, using somebody else in the art historical canon as a touchstone. There's a Wilhelm Trubner piece, his Salome rendering of oil on cardboard, actually at the Milwaukee Art Museum. It's always been my favorite piece there. So this is my iteration of it with simply small kind of tchotchke-like figurines that I keep around. But again, it's just this really, really bright sunlit moment. And then I was able to capture a really similar intensity of sun beaming through the window on in my studio, actually. And yes, again, like bringing them together, even though they're so similar but so different. I love how visceral that the brushwork is in her flesh, in contrast to these like very smooth porcelain objects. Seeing the way, just in a very raw way, light hits different things differently. I didn't have the model that he had. I had the models that I had, which are just these, precious small objects, precious to me. But yeah, I think there's that difference. Again, it's typically very, it's I think a biblical story in origin, right? So it might have a seriousness to it, but within a new context, perhaps less so. I mean, technically, there is a severed head in the painting. There's also a very cheeky little plush rabbit right next to it, which is a combination that might be new, might be just something very strange and at the same time wholesome that we can kind of bite into all together. So there's a photography book by Kohei Yoshiyuki that came out, I believe, in the late 70s, early 80s, which is pretty coveted within like the art photography realms. And it's a small book of an artist, a photographer, I guess, who went into kind of like a makeout spot late at night in a park and kind of shot different couples at various like unexpected moments, like high flash. And it's a really kind of ethereal and surreal series of images, very risque. But again, I think I kept making the connection between those photos in Kohei Yoshiyuki's photo series and maybe like trail cam footage that you might see of wild animals. And again, that idea that maybe we're not the same creature, but we're honestly, I don't think, not as different to these wild animals as I think some might want to assume. And I think that photography series is a really good way to kind of bridge the two at times, I guess, to find more commonalities with, a wild coyote, a rabbit at dusk, raccoons at dawn, whatever you're seeing out there, right? That kind of has a shiny look in its eye. We're not so different, we have those base instincts. I think it behooves one to just acknowledge that at the very least. So yes, I have more kind of re-renderings of those photographs in several of the pieces in the back of the exhibition, most notably Omikuji Trail Cam. And part of this whole pink vertical piece is it's a fortune that you would grab around New Year's from shrines around Japan. And this was a particularly lucky one. It's, there's levels of luck, but this is one that I got that I spliced up and altered its arrangement. But it's supposed to be like a very heartfelt and lucky fortune. But then again, there's a little bit more of these nighttime mysterious moments interspliced. So I think that was probably the second piece that was done for this series. So right from the get-go, I had the Omikuji piece and then the sunlit and unbalanced piece. And then I started to feel like I had something that I could keep growing, and that it kind of had a yin and yang contrast built in from the ground up. I hope to keep treating spaces in the same way that I do individual picture planes in paintings and drawings. I'm really excited about the future in that respect. I've just come off both this show and another show where things were getting much more installation-like and immersive. And I'm very excited to keep doing that going forward, taking what I've learned, putting this show together, and applying that to even more spaces, you know, specific to them, I think is the best way to do it, right? And yeah, so I think of a lot of this as a beginning in ways as well. So I would say that too.